A small-town mechanic mopping up an oil spill never imagined he was cleaning up the start of his own love story, with a billionaire filmmaker hiding from fame. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The late afternoon sun cast a honey-colored glow over the main drag of Silver Ridge, where time moved a little slower and nobody was ever in too much of a hurry. Drew Carter stood outside his modest garage, a rag slung over his shoulder, the scent of motor oil clinging to his shirt. Business had been quiet that day, just a couple tire rotations and an alternator swap, but Drew didn't mind the lull. Quiet meant Jake was having a good day at school. Quiet meant no surprises. But just as he was locking up, a glint of white caught his eye across the street. A luxury Range Rover idled near the curb, its hazard lights blinking like a distress call. Something shimmered beneath it, oil glistening dark against the pavement. Drew's instincts kicked in. He didn't think, just grabbed an old bag of shop towels and jogged across the road. "Everything all right?" he called out, crouching beside the vehicle. The driver's side door opened with a soft click, and a woman stepped out. She was dressed simply, jeans, a black sweater, sunglasses too big for her face, but something about her posture was commanding, like she was used to giving orders and having them followed. Still, there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes as she looked down at the spreading slick. "I think something's leaking," she said, her voice even, clipped with concern. "Yeah, looks like your oil pan might have taken a hit." Drew glanced up, offering a reassuring half-smile. "Nothing too dramatic. I'll get it cleaned up so no one slips." Without waiting for a response, he dropped to one knee, pressing towels into the mess, working fast but careful. The woman stood nearby, arms crossed, watching him with a furrowed brow, not annoyed, more like curious. "You don't have to do that," she said after a beat. "I know," Drew replied, not looking up, "but if I don't, someone else's tires are going to pay for it." A pause, then, "You run that garage?" He nodded. "Drew Carter. Been here since I could hold a wrench." She hesitated, then offered a hand. "Eliza, just Eliza." Drew took it, warm and firm in his calloused grip. Neither of them knew it yet, but that handshake was the first take of a very real love story. The woman stood with a kind of stillness that didn't match the chaos under her car. Oil was still dripping faintly from the undercarriage, forming a slick little pool near the curb. Drew had done what he could, wiped most of it, tossed the soaked towels into a bin in the back of his truck. But the woman remained, hands buried in the pockets of her fitted jacket, sunglasses shading her eyes, even though the sun was already dipping behind the mountains. "Thanks for jumping in like that," she said, her voice low but smooth, like she was used to being heard without raising it. "No problem," Drew replied, brushing his hands off on his jeans. "Better me than someone ending up sideways in a ditch." She offered a faint smile, the kind people give when they're not quite sure if they're welcome. The brim of a dark baseball cap dipped slightly forward, casting a shadow across her face. It took Drew a second to realize it wasn't just the lighting. She was hiding. "You local?" he asked, trying to keep his tone light. "Just passing through," she said, almost too quickly. Then, after a pause, "Car started acting up about 10 miles back. Was hoping to make it through town before it gave out." "Well," Drew said, glancing toward the garage, "you're in luck. I know a guy." That earned a small laugh. She pulled her jacket tighter around her. "Appreciate it, Drew, really." He raised a brow. "And you are?" There was a beat, a noticeable one. Then she smiled again, this time a little easier. "Eliza," she said simply. "No last name?" he teased. Another pause. "Not today." Drew didn't press. He wasn't the type. He'd seen enough folks pass through Silver Ridge trying to outrun something. Divorces, debts, bad choices. She didn't look like she was running from trouble exactly, but there was something in the way she held herself, like a person used to standing in a spotlight who was desperate to find some shade. "Well, Eliza," he said, nodding toward the garage, "let's see if we can get you back on the road, or at least off the sidewalk." She followed him without a word, her hat pulled low, sunglasses hiding more than just her eyes. The hood clunked shut with a solid thud, and Drew wiped the back of his hand across his forehead, leaving a faint streak of oil across his brow. The last of the late sun filtered through the garage door, casting golden lines across the concrete floor. The Range Rover, after a quick patch-up and a firm tightening of a few key components, purred quietly behind him like it had never broken down at all. Eliza stood nearby, arms still crossed, though the edge in her stance had softened. Her hat was now pushed back slightly, her sunglasses tucked into the collar of her jacket. There was something sharper in her gaze now, not suspicion, but attention, like she was watching him closely, trying to understand something that didn't quite fit. "She's all set," Drew said, stepping back and brushing his palms against his jeans. "Your oil filter housing was loose. Probably hit a pothole or something, common on these newer models. I tightened it and topped you off. You're good to go." Eliza tilted her head. "That's it?" "That's it." She reached into her bag, sleek black leather that didn't belong in a town where people still paid in crumpled tens, and pulled out a silver wallet. "How much do I owe you?" Drew shook his head before she even got it open. "Nothing." She blinked. "Excuse me?" "No charge." He shrugged like it was nothing. "Didn't take me more than 20 minutes, and I had the oil in stock." Eliza stared at him, wallet still in hand. "You're seriously telling me you're not going to let me pay you?" "I'm telling you," he said, smiling faintly, "that kindness doesn't come with a receipt." She looked at him like he'd just said something in another language. Slowly, she tucked the wallet back into her bag, her expression unreadable. "That's rare," she murmured. "Maybe," Drew said, heading toward the workbench, "but around here, it's just how we do things." As she turned to leave, she glanced back at him once more, something like a question flickering behind her eyes. But she didn't ask it. Not yet. Instead, she slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled away, the sound of her tires fading into the dusk. Drew watched her go, a strange feeling settling in his chest. He didn't know her story, but something told him it wasn't over yet. The road stretched out ahead of her, narrow and flanked by fields, washed in the last light of day. Eliza kept one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting loosely in her lap as the Range Rover hummed beneath her. The engine was smooth again, too smooth for a vehicle that had left her stranded just an hour earlier. She glanced at the rearview mirror, catching the garage in the distance, growing smaller with every passing second. Drew Carter. He hadn't asked questions. He hadn't acted impressed or suspicious. He'd just helped her, hands steady, words few, eyes clear. That kind of honesty, it was rare, maybe extinct in her world. At the next stop sign, she pulled over. She sat for a long beat in the quiet, the dashboard lights casting a faint glow across her face. Then, almost without thinking, she reached into the cup holder for her phone. She tapped through the camera roll, swiping past a flurry of location stills, shot lists, and staged scenes from her latest production, all of it controlled, directed, safe. She opened the video app, switched to the front camera, paused, then flipped it around. With careful fingers, she scrolled back and tapped a tiny clip she'd caught earlier, accidentally on purpose, when Drew had been crouched near the car, hands deep in oil and grit, his voice soft as he reassured her everything would be okay. The image was simple, a man working quietly, no angles, no poses, just real. She hit play. The audio was a little rough, wind brushing the mic, but his tone came through clear, kind, unpolished, human. Eliza watched the clip again, then saved it to a private folder titled Inspiration. A part of her knew exactly what she was doing. The other part, well, the other part just felt something stir in her chest that had been silent for a long time. She put the car in drive and merged back onto the road. Behind her, Silver Ridge faded into the shadows. Ahead, the Hollywood skyline waited, sharp and glittering. But somewhere in between, Eliza Monroe, producer, filmmaker, guarded heart, had just found a new scene worth writing. She didn't know it yet, but the story had already begun. The skyline of Los Angeles shimmered through the glass walls of Eliza Monroe's office, all sun-glinting towers and artificial promise. Below, traffic moved like a restless current, but up here, on the 34th floor of her production company, everything was still, too still. Eliza stood in the center of the room, arms crossed, staring at the whiteboard that spanned the far wall. Names of characters, plot arcs, and dialogue snippets were scribbled across it in a dozen colors. All of it carefully constructed, all of it carefully wrong. She sighed, yanked the cap off a dry erase marker, and began crossing lines through her own words. Big X's slashed through Mila, socialite with a heart of gold. Arrows obliterated fake breakup, real love, and penthouse proposal with drones. The story she'd been working on, an empty, glossy love story set against the backdrop of designer brands and predictable tropes, felt brittle now, manufactured, like plastic flowers under a spotlight. It wasn't real, not like Silver Ridge, not like the man with oil on his hands and decency in his bones. She turned to her desk and picked up her phone. The clip she'd saved of Drew was still there. She watched it again just for a moment. He didn't know he was being filmed, didn't pose, didn't care. It wasn't a performance, it was just him being good. And that's what caught her. Not the fix-it-all trope, not the city meets country charm, just kindness, unfiltered. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Slowly, deliberately, she typed a new title at the top of a fresh script document. The realest scene. She wrote the first line without thinking. Interior, a small-town garage. Sunset. A man unaware of the camera wipes oil from his hands. He is not handsome in the way actors are, but he is real. Eliza exhaled. Her phone buzzed. An assistant reminding her about a lunch with a studio exec. She ignored it. For the first time in weeks, the noise outside didn't matter. Because she wasn't writing what they wanted. She was writing what she needed. And it all started with a man who didn't charge her a dime. The sound of the wrench slipping and clanking onto the floor echoed through the garage, followed by a muttered curse and the scrape of Drew reaching for it again. His hands were black with grease, the creases in his knuckles darkened by 1,000 small fixes and long days. The air smelled like rubber, oil, and old coffee, a scent he was so used to it had become the background noise of his life. Outside, the sun was starting to dip behind the hills, casting a dusky gold across Silver Ridge. Another day winding down. Another stack of receipts to tally. Another car that probably should have been junked 3 years ago, now held together by stubbornness and hope. Drew stood, stretched his back, and wiped his hands on a rag that had seen better days. He glanced at the clock, 6:42 p.m. Time to wrap up. He hit the lights in the garage, locked up the back bay, and made his way across the lot to the little 2-bedroom house behind the shop. The porch light was already on. Jake always remembered to flip it before sunset. Inside, the TV was playing low in the living room, cartoons flickering across the screen. Jake sat cross-legged on the couch, grinning, as animated characters zipped around. He was 20, but some days he had the wonder of a 5-year-old and the heart of someone twice his age. "Hey, buddy," Drew said, ruffling his brother's hair as he passed. Jake looked up and beamed. "You're late. We were going to have tacos." "I know," Drew said with a smile, "but your famous microwave nachos will have to do tonight." Jake didn't complain. He rarely did. Drew pulled off his work shirt, tossed it in the laundry basket, and moved to the kitchen to warm up dinner. Cheap tortillas, shredded cheese, and the last of a can of beans. Gourmet by necessity. They ate side by side on the couch, Jake chatting about his day at the community center and a puzzle he almost finished. Drew nodded, listening, the weight of bills and busted engines hanging quietly behind his smile. Life wasn't glamorous. It was schedules, oil changes, and making sure Jake always had clean clothes and food on the table. But somehow Drew made it work. because this was family, and for him that was everything. The sky over Silver Ridge was painted in soft pinks and burnt orange as Eliza Monroe's car eased past the faded "Welcome to Silver Ridge" sign. The scent of pine and distant chimney smoke crept in through the cracked window. It had only been a week since she left, but the place felt like a different planet compared to the sharp-edged energy of Los Angeles. Out here, the air moved slower, quieter, easier. Her GPS had no trouble finding the garage again. Carter Auto Repair, with its rusting sign and gravel lot, stood just as she remembered it. The big bay doors were half open, spilling warm yellow light onto the driveway. A familiar figure moved inside, crouched beneath the hood of some weathered pickup. Drew. She didn't pull in. Not yet. Instead, she drove past and parked 2 blocks down in front of the diner. She needed to think, rehearse, pretend this wasn't what it was. She was here to scout. That was the line she'd used in the email to her assistant, in the call to the studio head. Silver Ridge has texture, she'd said. It's authentic. Could be a perfect setting for a grounded love story, which wasn't a lie, not technically. But the real reason she was here didn't fit on a location form. She wasn't scouting a set. She was chasing a feeling, a man. Eliza sat in the car, engine idling, wondering what he'd say when he saw her. Wondering if he'd be glad or annoyed. Wondering why exactly she couldn't stop thinking about someone who lived in a world so far from hers it might as well be fiction. After a minute, she grabbed her sunglasses, even though the sun was nearly gone, and stepped out. She wasn't dressed like a director today. No sharp heels, no black leather bag, just jeans, boots, and a jacket she'd picked up from a thrift store on a whim. She walked slowly toward the garage, heart pounding harder than it had any right to. Whatever she was about to say, she knew one thing for sure: this wasn't about a movie anymore. The small house on Maple Street was nothing like Eliza Monroe's Bel Air estate. It had creaky steps, chipped paint around the windows, and a roof that groaned every time the wind picked up. But the porch swing worked, the neighbors waved without staring too hard at, and at night the only sounds were crickets and the occasional distant bark of a dog. Eliza signed the lease under her middle name, Grace, claiming she was a writer looking for inspiration in the quiet of the country. It wasn't far from the truth. The town believed it. Mostly. The first few days she kept to herself. She walked the town, jotting notes in a small black notebook, sipping coffee at the diner where the waitresses called everyone Han, and the menu hadn't changed since the 90s. She browsed the hardware store, asked questions she already knew the answers to, just to hear the way people explained things in plain language. And each day, she found her steps drifting past Carter Auto. She didn't go inside, not yet. Sometimes Drew was visible through the open garage bay, under a car, wiping down a fender, or laughing with a teenager in a hoodie who looked enough like him to be family. She watched from across the street, always telling herself she'd just happened to pass by. But the truth was harder to ignore with each visit. On Friday, she stopped by the community center after reading a flyer tacked to a telephone pole. Open mic and puzzle night. She didn't know what that meant, but something about the childish lettering made her curious. Inside, she found mismatched chairs, a homemade popcorn machine, and a group of people who welcomed her like she belonged. Jake was there too. She recognized him from the garage. Same grin, same bright energy. He was holding up a puzzle piece and calling out to someone across the room. Eliza smiled when she heard it. "Drew, I found the corner." Drew appeared with a Coke in one hand and a smile that could disarm a tank. He sat beside his brother, ruffling his hair before leaning over to help. Eliza's heart skipped. This wasn't part of her research. This was something else. And for the first time in a very long while, she didn't feel like she was directing the story. She felt like she was in one. The morning air in Silver Ridge had that crisp edge that hinted fall was creeping in early this year. The sun had barely broken over the hills, painting the tops of the trees in gold. At Carter Auto, the garage door was already open. the scent of motor oil drifting into the breeze like it belonged there. Drew stood hunched over the open hood of an old Buick, sleeves rolled up, focus locked in. When he heard footsteps crunch on gravel behind him, he didn't look up at first. "I brought coffee," Eliza said, holding out a tray with 2 cups and a cautious smile. That got his attention. He straightened, wiping his hands on a rag, eyes squinting against the sun as he turned toward her. "You always show up with peace offerings?" "Only when I feel like I'm showing up uninvited," she replied. He took the cup and nodded toward the folding chairs just outside the bay. "All right then, you've earned 10 minutes." They sat, elbows resting on their knees, sipping slowly. There was a quiet between them, not awkward, just honest. Eliza looked down at her coffee, then glanced sideways. "So this your plan? Fix cars, keep your head down, ride out life in a garage?" Drew chuckled. "You make it sound like a prison sentence." "I didn't mean it like that. It's simple. Most people I know live their lives like they're racing something. You don't seem to be in a hurry." He stared out toward the road. "That's because I'm not. I already know what matters." "Which is?" "My brother. This shop. People who do what they say and mean what they feel." He took another sip. "What about you? You got all the money, the movies, the meetings, but you're in Silver Ridge pretending to be a writer named Grace." She smiled faintly. "I got tired of everyone knowing who I am, but never really seeing me." Drew looked at her, long and slow. "Well, I see you." The words hung there between them, heavier than they sounded. Eliza didn't say anything right away. She didn't need to, because in that quiet, something real was starting to grow. The first rumble came low and distant, like a warning whispered beneath the wind. Drew glanced up from the workbench, frowning as the sky darkened outside the open garage bay. Rain wasn't unusual in Silver Ridge, but this storm rolled in fast, thick clouds bruising the horizon, the wind kicking up dust and loose leaves in a sudden swirling gust. Eliza looked up from the stool where she'd been flipping through a tattered auto manual, her legs crossed, coffee long since gone cold. "That's not just a drizzle," she said, brows lifting as thunder cracked a little closer. Drew moved to the door and pulled the garage bay halfway down with a hard tug. "Nope. That's the kind of storm that likes to knock out power and turn the road into soup." The rain hit like it was thrown by hand, loud and heavy, pinging off the metal roof in an angry rhythm. Within minutes, the world outside had vanished behind a curtain of gray. Eliza stood and walked to the edge of the garage, watching water rush down the gutters and pool in the gravel lot. "Guess I'm not going anywhere." Drew glanced over his shoulder. "Didn't peg you for the storm-stuck type." She smirked. "Didn't peg you for the hospitality type." "Touché." He grabbed a flashlight just in case, and then disappeared into the back room. When he returned, he was carrying 2 old blankets and a box of Pop-Tarts. "Emergency rations," he said, tossing the box onto the workbench with a grin. "Take your pick, brown sugar or mystery berry." Eliza laughed, really laughed, and something in Drew's chest did a quiet flip. They sat on the floor near the tool wall, the storm rumbling around them, flickers of lightning casting strange shadows across the shop. For a while they just talked, about childhood, about movies that actually meant something, about how Jake believed the moon controlled luck, not tides, about how Drew never left town because the people here still remembered his parents by name. And then Eliza almost said it, almost told him who she really was, but the words stopped at the edge of her throat. The storm was still raging, but this moment, this strange, flickering peace, felt too fragile to risk. So instead she leaned back against the toolbox, let the thunder roll, and said, "I don't think I've felt this calm in years." Drew didn't say anything. He just handed her another Pop-Tart and smiled, like he understood. And in that warm little pocket of quiet, with the world outside in chaos, something unspoken passed between them, close but not quite ready, not yet. The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind soaked roads and the earthy scent of wet pine drifting through town. Sunlight filtered through the high windows of the garage, casting gold streaks across the concrete floor. Drew was already back at work, sleeves rolled, tools in hand, as if the night before had never happened. Eliza sat at the corner of the workbench, notebook open, pen poised, but her thoughts weren't on the sketch of Silver Ridge she'd half-doodled in the margins. They were on him, on how easily she had slipped into his world, how natural it felt, how wrong it was, still, that he didn't know the truth. She'd nearly told him last night. One breath away from it, in the hush between thunderclaps and Pop-Tarts. But fear held her back, the fear that the version of her he liked might dissolve the moment he saw the headlines. Eliza Monroe, the billionaire director hiding in plain sight. He'd look at her differently, like everyone else did, and then the realness would be gone. So she stayed silent. Instead, she poured it into pages. That night, back in her rented house, she opened her laptop and began writing, not her planned script, but their story. The real one, sort of. Interior, small-town garage. Night. The storm outside is loud. Inside, it's quieter than it should be. The man hands her a blanket, not knowing he's already given her something warmer. The words spilled out like breath. Scenes based on things Drew had said, details only she knew. The way his hand lingered on the doorframe when he laughed, how he looked down when he was thinking, like the floor might offer better answers than people ever did. She didn't name him Drew in the script. She called him West, strong, steady, facing storms without flinching. She called her character Claire, not Eliza, not Grace. Someone somewhere between. By midnight she had 5 pages, by morning 10, but the guilt sat heavy. Each page was a confession she hadn't made. Each scene, a truth he didn't know was being written down. And still, she kept writing. Because stories were how she made sense of the world. And this one? This one was starting to matter too much to keep off the page. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the ridge, casting warm shadows across the lot in front of Carter Auto when the battered minivan pulled in, coughing out a trail of white smoke before lurching to a stop. Eliza looked up from where she sat on a folding chair just outside the garage, notebook in her lap, pen idle. The van looked like it had been through a war zone, dented fender, mismatched tires, paint peeling from the roof. The woman who stepped out wore fatigue like a second skin. She had a toddler on her hip, another kid trailing behind with a backpack nearly his size, and a look on her face like she'd used up every ounce of strength getting here. "Hey, Mindy," Drew called, already wiping his hands on a shop rag as he stepped out from under the hood of a pickup. "Drew, I'm so sorry to just show up," she said, shifting the toddler to her other hip. It started rattling again, and then the heater gave out. "I can't keep pulling them around in a freezing car." "Don't worry," he interrupted gently. "Let me take a look." Eliza watched as Drew crouched beside the van, popping the hood like it was routine, not a surprise or a burden. He asked the older kid about school, offered the toddler a candy from the jar inside the garage, and reassured Mindy without sugarcoating the fix. "You've been driving on a cracked belt," he told her. "I'll patch it up enough to get you through the week. Then you bring it back, and I'll replace it. No charge." Mindy blinked. "Drew?" He raised a hand. "We'll call it even after that pie you brought in July. Deal?" Mindy gave a watery laugh and nodded. Eliza sat still, notebook forgotten. There was no show in it, no performance. Just a man doing what needed to be done, like helping people was as ordinary as changing a tire. She felt it again, that tug in her chest she couldn't quite name. Not attraction, not yet. Respect. The kind of respect that roots deep, the kind that lasts longer than charm or money or good lighting. She'd seen thousands of heroes on screen, but Drew Carter was something else entirely. He was real, and she was starting to fall for that. It started with a whisper. Monday morning at Carter Auto was like any other. Coffee brewed too strong. Drew elbow deep in the guts of an old Chevy. Jake sweeping the garage floor with music playing low from the radio. Outside, the chill clung to the air, sharp and dry, but the garage was warm with movement and the quiet rhythm of routine. Then, just before noon, Drew noticed it. A couple of regulars, Marv and Tammy from the feed store, stood by the waiting bench, whispering over a phone screen. Tammy glanced up and quickly looked away when she caught Drew's eye. Marv gave an awkward half-smile and nudged her, as if to say, "Don't be rude," but she kept looking at the phone. Drew wiped his hands and approached. "Something wrong with the car?" Tammy fumbled to lock the screen. No, just catching up on the news." He didn't press. But he didn't forget either. It wasn't until later, while grabbing a sandwich at the diner, that he heard it again, this time from the next booth over. "Looks just like her, doesn't it?" a teenager whispered to her friend, screen tilted low. "Same hat, same sunglasses. That's definitely her." Drew leaned back, brow furrowed. When he returned to the garage, he found Eliza already waiting by the bay, arms crossed, jaw tight. "You seen it yet?" she asked. No greeting, no smile. "Seen what?" She held up her phone and turned it toward him. The photo was grainy, taken from across the street, but there was no mistaking the subject. Eliza, hat, sunglasses, coffee in hand, walking past the garage last Thursday. The caption beneath read, "Hollywood's Eliza Monroe spotted in rural town, a break from the spotlight, or something more." Drew's expression didn't change much, but Eliza saw it, the flicker in his eyes, the piece of quiet shifting between them. "I didn't want this," she said, voice low. "I came here to breathe, not to be chased." Drew looked away, jaw tightening. "Yeah, funny thing about cameras, they show up when you least want them." She flinched, but he wasn't finished. "So are you going to tell me who you really are, or do I have to keep finding out from everyone else?" The air thickened between them. The truth had cracked the frame, and Drew wasn't sure what he saw anymore. The next morning dawned bright but brittle, the kind of light that made sharp edges out of everything. Drew worked quietly, his movements clipped, focused, like he was trying to will the day into behaving. The garage was busy, too busy for questions, too busy for thinking. But somehow, Eliza still found her way into his orbit. She showed up mid-morning with 2 coffees and a silence that clung to her like a second jacket. Drew didn't greet her right away. He kept his eyes on the engine he was rebuilding, hands steady but jaw tight. Eliza set the coffees on the workbench, a peace offering, without the words to go with it. "You're still mad," she said finally, voice soft. "I'm not mad," he replied, not looking up. "I just don't like being blindsided." Eliza leaned against the edge of the bench, watching him. "I didn't want it to be like this. I didn't come here with a plan to manipulate anything." "You came here with secrets," he said, wrench clicking against the bolt. "Same thing, depending on who you ask." The air between them crackled, not just with tension, but something warmer, messier, something they hadn't named yet. "I'm not the kind of person who does this," Eliza said after a pause. "Hide, lie, and definitely not care what someone thinks about me." Drew looked up then, really looked. "But you do?" She didn't answer right away, just nodded. He sighed and set the wrench down, wiping his hands on a rag. "Look, I don't pretend to know what your life's like. All I know is I've spent most of mine with my head down, taking care of Jake, keeping the lights on, making sure I don't let anyone down. That doesn't leave much room for other things." Eliza tilted her head. "Like love?" "Like anything that might break if I'm not careful." They stood in the quiet of the garage, the hum of the heater filling the space between them. For a moment, it felt like something was shifting, like a page was about to turn. Eliza opened her mouth, her heart beat faster. "Tell him." But instead she said, "I'm sorry about the photo. I'll handle it." And just like that, the truth stayed buried. For now. The late afternoon sun slanted through the front windows of the garage, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. Drew was elbow deep in a transmission when he heard the unmistakable sound of heels, too sharp, too fast for Silver Ridge. He straightened, wiping his hands on a rag, and turned toward the door just in time to see a petite woman in a crisp blazer stepping inside, holding a stack of manila folders and an expensive-looking leather tote. "Hi, I'm looking for Eliza or Grace, I guess," the woman said brightly, eyes scanning the shop. "She said this was where she'd be." Drew blinked. "She's around. Might be at the community center with my brother." The woman didn't seem fazed. "Great, I'm her assistant, Rachel. Just flew in for the afternoon to go over a script draft she wanted to share. We're running a bit behind, but this place is charming." She said the last part like she was surprised it hadn't collapsed under its own rust. Drew nodded slowly. "Script, huh?" "Yep," Rachel chirped, pulling out her phone to check the time. "We've got a table read scheduled back at her rental. She said it's a new project, personal, small town, honest. Thought it'd be a good change from the usual glitz." She set the folders down on the workbench with a dramatic sigh. "Anyway, I'll just leave these here. Can you let her know I stopped by?" "Sure," Drew said, eyes lingering on the folders. Rachel gave him a quick smile and vanished as fast as she came, her heels tapping down the pavement. Drew hesitated. He wasn't nosy by nature, but something about the way Rachel had said personal stuck with him. He reached out and opened the top folder. The title page read, "The Realist Scene," written by Eliza Monroe. His brow furrowed. He flipped to the first few pages. Scene 1. A woman in a luxury car broken down by a small-town garage. Scene 2. A quiet mechanic wiping oil off his hands. Dialogue followed, his dialogue nearly word for word. Drew closed the folder, heart thudding. When Eliza returned later that evening, he was waiting on the porch of her rental, the script sitting beside him. "Is this what you came here for?" he asked, voice low. She opened her mouth, closed it. The truth was on the page now, and this time he'd read it for himself. The wind had picked up overnight, tugging yellow leaves off the trees and scattering them across the road like forgotten notes. Drew stood outside the shop, hands tucked into the pockets of his hoodie, watching the sky bruise with early morning gray. The garage hadn't opened yet, but his mind had been restless since the moment he woke. He hadn't brought up the script again, not when Eliza came by with coffee the next day, not when she offered a soft, almost guilty smile that didn't quite meet his eyes. He told himself it wasn't worth the conversation, not yet. But the folder sat on his kitchen table, every scene a reminder that someone had been writing about him while pretending not to. Jake's voice broke the stillness as he stepped out onto the porch, tablet in hand. "Hey, Drew," he called, brow furrowed. "Why is Eliza on this website?" Drew blinked. "What website?" Jake walked over, holding up the screen. A gossip blog, the kind with bright headlines, flashing ads, and more rumor than fact. But the picture at the top was sharp. Eliza, leaning against the front of the garage, sunglasses off, laughing at something Drew had said. Exclusive. Eliza Monroe trading red carpets for rust. Oscar-winning director spotted with mystery mechanic in small town. Drew's stomach dropped. He snatched the tablet gently from Jake's hands and scrolled. The article was filled with speculation about her secret romance, the humble local man, the indie script inspired by a real-life connection. Quotes from unnamed sources, screen grabs. One even mentioned the realist scene by title. She hadn't told him. Not really. Not about who she was. Not about how public this could become. Not about how long she'd been using his life as creative fuel. Jake looked up at him. "You okay?" Drew didn't answer. The wind picked up again, and across the lot, a cracked windshield on an old truck shimmered in the light, fractured, but still holding together. He thought of her laugh, her silence, the almost confessions that never quite came. She'd written about him like he was some symbol of honesty, and yet she'd lied every step of the way. He turned and walked inside, letting the screen door slam shut behind him. The damage wasn't just to the car anymore. It was personal now. The days that followed moved like molasses, thick, heavy and slow, even when the world around Drew refused to stop spinning. The garage stayed busy, maybe more than usual, though he wasn't sure if it was just word getting around about that mechanic from the blog or if people were genuinely in need of repairs. He didn't ask. He didn't talk much at all. He showed up early, before sunrise, and stayed late enough that the moon would be hanging crooked over the ridge by the time he turned the lights off. The work was loud, distracting. That helped. Grinding brakes, sputtering engines, leaking radiators, all of it gave him something to fix, something to pour himself into instead of thinking about her. Eliza didn't come by, not after the article, not after the look he'd given her the day he found out. A look that said, "Don't." A look that told her what words couldn't. Jake asked once, maybe twice, where she was. Drew brushed it off with a shrug, pretending the conversation didn't land deep. "She's probably gone," he muttered, tightening a bolt too hard and stripping the thread. By Friday, the whole shop smelled like burnt oil and stale coffee. Drew stood hunched over a carburetor, sweat slicking his back even though the air was crisp. His knuckles were raw, wrapped in tape from wrench slips and busted lines. He hadn't shaved, barely eaten. The silence had settled into his bones. What hurt the most wasn't the fame or the script. It wasn't even the photos. It was that he'd let himself hope. That maybe, for once, someone had seen him for more than his work boots and oil stains. That someone had chosen to stay, not because he needed help, but because she wanted to. And now, she was gone, and he was right back where he started. Just a man in a garage, doing a job no one noticed unless something was broken. Smoke curled up from the welding bench, curling into the rafters. He kept his head down, hands moving, heart locked behind silence and steel. The cursor blinked at her like it was daring her to be honest. Eliza sat cross-legged on the worn rug in her rental's living room, script pages strewn around her like pieces of a life she wasn't sure belonged to her anymore. The room was dim except for the glow of her laptop and a single desk lamp buzzing faintly in the corner. Rain tapped gently at the windows, less dramatic than that stormy night in the garage, but somehow lonelier. She stared at the words on the screen. Scene 27. Interior. Garage, night. The mechanic discovers the truth. The woman fumbles. He walks away. In the first draft it had been clean, neat. He was hurt, but noble. She was misunderstood, but strong, and somehow, in the end, it made them both look better than they deserved. But now, that version felt like a lie. Eliza exhaled slowly, then pressed delete. Line by line she erased the polished version of their falling apart, the perfect pacing, the conveniently timed reconciliation. Gone. And then, with trembling fingers, she began again. Sector 27. Interior garage. Night. She watches him work, knowing the silence is her fault. He doesn't look at her, doesn't speak. The betrayal isn't just about what she did, it's about what she didn't say when she had the chance. She breaks the silence. Woman. You said kindness doesn't come with a receipt. Turns away. But maybe honesty does, and I didn't pay it. He stops working, looks up, finally. Eliza paused. Her throat tightened. This wasn't a scene anymore. It was a confession in screenplay form, not for an audience, not for box office numbers, but for him, for Drew, who had shown her what integrity looked like without even knowing he'd done it. She kept writing. Words poured out, not tidy, not perfect, but real. She wrote the regret, the doubt, the ache. She wrote a version of herself who didn't know what to do with love when it came in dirty boots and soft silences. By the time she finished, dawn had started to stretch over Silver Ridge. She leaned back, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was her apology. Jake sat cross-legged on the bench outside the community center, cradling a lukewarm hot chocolate in both hands. His hoodie sleeves were too long, swallowed up in his fingers, and his sneakers had one lace stubbornly untied. He wasn't smiling today, not the way he usually did when Eliza showed up with puzzles or popcorn or a new story to tell. She sat beside him quietly, unsure if she had the right to. The last time she'd seen Drew, he'd barely looked at her, like she was a stranger walking out of a theater with his name on the credits. Jake finally spoke, voice soft but steady. "He doesn't talk about you anymore." Eliza stared down at her hands. "I know." Jake took a slow sip. "But he thinks about you." "How do you know that?" she asked, almost afraid of the answer. Jake shrugged. "Because when people leave, he goes quiet. But when people matter, he works too much." That hit harder than it should have. She looked over at him, heart aching with guilt she couldn't script her way out of. "I hurt him," she said, the words tasting like rust on her tongue. "Not on purpose. I thought I could keep the real me separate from the story, but I couldn't." Jake looked at her for a long moment. Then he leaned over, tugged his tablet out of his backpack, and scrolled through something before holding it up. It was her script. Not the leaked blog version, the new one, the one she'd rewritten in a haze of guilt and truth. "Drew's not going to read this unless someone makes him," Jake said. "He thinks it's just another movie with his face on it." She swallowed hard. "It's not. It's everything I should have said." Jake nodded. "Then say it." "To him?" "No," Jake grinned faintly. "To everyone, so he can't run from it." Eliza stared at the screen, her rewritten Scene 27 glowing softly in the fading afternoon light. Jake stood up and patted her shoulder. "Don't bring flowers. He won't know what to do with those." "What should I bring?" He smiled wider. "Bring the truth. That's all he's ever wanted." And just like that, she knew what came next. The studio lights buzzed softly overhead, but Eliza barely noticed them. Her makeup was minimal, just enough to satisfy the production team. Hair pulled back, no designer dress, no velvet chair, just a stool, a glass of water, and the sound guy telling her they were rolling in 5. It wasn't the press junket she was used to. No glittering premiere, no polished talking points. This was something else, something she'd insisted on. "Ready when you are," the producer said from behind the camera. Eliza took a breath. Not the kind you take before a performance, but the kind you take when you're standing on the edge of something real. "Hi," she said, her voice steady, unpolished. "I'm Eliza Monroe, and I guess this is me?" Without the edit. There was a pause. She let it sit. No one interrupted. "I've made a lot of movies. A lot of stories that looked great in theaters. Perfect arcs. Beautiful endings. But they weren't always true." Her gaze didn't waver. "And then I left L.A. for a while. I went to a small town. Just to clear my head, I told myself." She smiled faintly, not the kind meant for headlines, just a quiet, honest curve. "I met someone there, a mechanic. He didn't know who I was, didn't care. He fixed my car, wouldn't take my money, and didn't ask for anything except maybe a little honesty." Her voice dipped slightly, softer now. "He reminded me that kindness doesn't need an audience, that doing the right thing isn't a brand. It's just a choice." The crew behind the camera was silent. You could hear a pin drop. "I hurt him," she continued. "Not with words, but with the silence between them. And I wrote a script to make sense of that, not because it's marketable, but because it's the only way I know how to apologize when I've run out of excuses." She let the words breathe, then leaned forward. "So if you're watching this and wondering what the realist scene is really about, it's not a love story about two people who meet cute in the rain. It's about a man who reminded me what matters when I'd forgotten, and I hope somehow it reaches him." The camera's red light dimmed. The crew looked stunned. Eliza didn't wait for their approval. She stood, stepped off the set, and whispered to herself, "Take one," was the only take that mattered. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound inside Carter Auto that afternoon. Outside, the sun was bright but cold, the kind of late autumn day where the sky looks cheerful and the wind still bites. Drew was underneath a truck, sleeves pushed past his elbows, jaw tight with concentration. He hadn't spoken much all day, not to Jake, Not to customers, not to himself. He didn't hear the door open, just the soft creak of boots on concrete. He recognized the rhythm before he saw her. "Eliza?" he said flatly, rolling out from under the truck, wiping his hands on a towel already stained with a dozen other jobs. She didn't smile, didn't try to soften it. She stood there in jeans, her old jacket, no makeup, hair wind-blown. She looked tired, but grounded. "There are no cameras," she said. "Well, no assistants, no script." Drew leaned against the workbench, arms crossed, the silence stretching between them like a wire pulled tight. "I saw the interview," he finally said. "I figured. It was honest." "That's the idea." Her voice cracked a little. She didn't hide it. Drew's eyes searched hers. "Why now?" She stepped closer, but not too close. "Because I finally realized I couldn't write my way out of this. I could make it poetic, make it pretty, but none of it meant anything if I didn't say it to your face." He said nothing, just waited. "I came here because I needed a break from the noise," she said. "But I stayed because of you. Because there was something in this town, in you, that reminded me who I used to be. Before the premieres, before the pressure." Drew looked down, jaw tightening again. "I should have told you who I was. I should have trusted you the way you trusted me when you handed me that free repair and said to pay it forward. I didn't, and I'm sorry." The lights buzzed overhead, steady and harsh, but neither of them flinched from it. Eliza swallowed hard. "You don't have to forgive me. I just needed you to hear the truth. From me, not from a screen." Drew was quiet for a long moment. Then softly, "You still owe me a belt replacement on that minivan." A pause, then Eliza smiled. "I guess I better stick around then." For the first time in weeks, Drew didn't look away. And under the bright, unflattering lights of the garage, something unspoken finally began to heal. The garage was quieter than usual. No customers, no phone ringing, just the steady clink of metal and the low creak of a socket wrench being loosened. Drew was bent over the engine of an old Ford, working the same spark plug he'd already replaced twice that week, not because it needed it, but because it kept his hands busy. Eliza stood nearby, leaning against the open passenger door, her arms crossed but her posture loose. She wasn't performing, not this time. No clever lines, no carefully measured pauses. Just a woman who'd messed up, standing in the same garage where everything had started. "I Googled spark plugs last night," she said, breaking the silence. "It didn't help much." Drew didn't look up. "They're simple, but important. If just one's out of sync, the whole thing runs rough." There was meaning in that sentence. She heard it. She deserved it. "I was out of sync," she said quietly. "With myself. With you." Drew tightened the last bolt, then finally stood and turned toward her. "So you came here to find yourself in the middle of nowhere?" "I came here to escape, but I found something better." She looked at him, voice steady. "I found someone who didn't care about what I could offer, just who I was. That scared me more than I want to admit." He studied her, his arms crossed now, mirroring her. "You lied." "I withheld," she corrected gently, "which still hurt you, and I own that." The honesty in her eyes was different now, less polished, more raw. Drew could see it, the way her hands fidgeted slightly, how she didn't break eye contact even when it got uncomfortable. It was a different kind of bravery, not movie brave, real brave. "I didn't know if I could trust you," he said after a moment. "I've spent my whole life protecting people who need me. I don't have the luxury of being fooled." "I'm not here to fool you," she said. "I'm just here, if that counts for anything." He let out a long breath, rubbed the back of his neck. "You know," he murmured, "spark plugs are easier to fix than people." Eliza gave a small smile. "But people are still worth fixing, right?" Drew didn't smile back, not yet. But something in his eyes shifted, just a little. Maybe that was enough for now. The days that followed moved differently, no longer stiff with tension, but cautious. like a dance they hadn't learned the steps to yet. Drew didn't forgive Eliza outright. He didn't forget either, but he let her sit with him while he worked, handed her tools when she asked, and even taught her how to gap a spark plug properly, twice, because she'd fumbled the first time and called the tool weird and judgy. They talked more now, not the light, flirty banter from before, but real talk, grounded, honest. Drew told her about the year after their parents died, how Jake barely spoke, how keeping the shop alive was the only way he felt like he could hold anything together. Eliza told him about the first time she sat in a director's chair, shaking behind the camera, terrified someone would figure out she wasn't as confident as she pretended to be. Each conversation peeled back a layer. Not everything was healed, but things were growing again, quiet and unforced. One evening, just before closing, Eliza stood near the open bay, watching Drew rinse grease off his hands at the outdoor sink. The air smelled like motor oil and early fall. She hesitated, then spoke. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I swear it's not a setup." Drew raised a brow. That's how every setup starts. Eliza grinned, but there was something serious underneath it. "I want you to come to the set." His smile faded slightly. "Of the movie?" She nodded. "Just once. Just to see it. No press, no red carpet. I'll tell them you're a consultant if it makes you feel better." Drew dried his hands on a towel, staring out across the lot. "I don't know, Eliza. That world, it's not mine." "I'm not asking you to live in it," she said. "I'm just asking you to see what came out of everything we went through, what you inspired." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at her the same way he looked at an engine he wasn't sure would turn over. Thoughtful, measured. "Just once?" he asked. "Just once." He nodded, barely, but it was enough, and she knew it. The film set looked nothing like Silver Ridge, and yet it felt hauntingly familiar. Drew stood just outside the edge of the action, hands in the pockets of his worn denim jacket, shoulders tense. Bright lights flooded the faux garage built on a soundstage. Every tool on the walls placed just right. Every oil stain on the floor artfully smudged to look authentic. It was eerie, watching his world rebuilt with intention, with purpose, with props that looked exactly like his, but weren't. Across the room, Eliza hovered near the director's monitor, headphones around her neck, eyes flicking between the screen and him. She wasn't giving orders today. She wasn't in command. She was just watching him watch them. "Rolling," someone shouted. "Scene 21, take 3. Drew turned toward the set. There he was, West. A fictional version of himself, played by some clean-shaven actor with too perfect posture and a suspiciously spotless flannel. And opposite him stood Claire, her voice breaking in all the right ways as she confessed the truth beneath the glow of overhead fluorescence. It was the garage scene. That scene. "I didn't lie to hurt you," the actress said, voice trembling. "I lied because I didn't think I was worth the real version of this." Drew exhaled slowly, the words hitting him like a gut punch. He had lived that moment, not scripted, not lit with intention, but raw, under humming lights and the smell of coolant and regret. Now, watching it play out, he didn't know what he felt. Part of him wanted to leave, part of him couldn't look away. He glanced back at Eliza. She was watching him, not the screen, not gauging reaction, not hoping for applause, just quietly, painfully present. Her eyes asked what her voice wouldn't. Does it feel true? Does it feel like enough? Drew nodded once, barely, but she saw it. When the take ended, polite applause echoed through the room. People moved around him. Lights shifted. Technicians adjusted things. But Drew stood still, the scene still unfolding in his chest. He wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time in weeks, he wasn't afraid to find out. The catering table was longer than his entire workbench back in Silver Ridge. Stainless steel trays held gourmet dishes Drew couldn't pronounce, and someone with a headset offered him lemon water like it was a sacred ritual. He took a black coffee instead, no cream, no sugar, and tried not to look like he was casing the joint. The studio lot buzzed like a beehive. People moved with purpose, radios crackling, lights shifting, clipboards flashing. Everything had a rhythm, but it wasn't one he knew. Not like the slow, methodical heartbeat of a garage. Not like the simple satisfaction of a bolt turning just right. Eliza walked toward him between takes, her headset slung around her neck, a half-smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "You look completely out of place," she said, gently teasing. Drew gave a dry chuckle. "That obvious?" She handed him a folded call sheet. "You should have seen me the first time I walked onto a set. I wore heels and nearly tripped over a dolly." He nodded, looking around. "It's a lot." "It is," she agreed, "but it's also kind of beautiful, in its own messy way. Organized chaos." "Exactly." Drew took a sip of coffee, watching an actor reapply grease to his cheek, as if that's how mechanics ever ended a shift. "You know," he said, "none of this feels like me, but the story, that part's real." Eliza's smile softened. "That's because it started with you." They stood side by side in the narrow alley between two trailers, the hum of the set carrying just far enough to remind them where they were. Drew looked down at the call sheet, then back at her. "So this is your world?" he asked. She nodded. "Most of the time." "It's fast," he said, loud, full of people trying to get it right. "Like yours isn't?" He glanced at her, then back toward the set where someone shouted for quiet. "I guess we're not so different." "No," Eliza said. "But you don't have to fit here, Drew. You just have to stand still long enough for people to see you." He looked at her, really looked. And for the first time since stepping onto the lot, he stopped trying to blend in and started just being. Between takes, under the lights, and behind the makeup, something quietly genuine had settled between them. Not a scene, not a performance, just them. The final cut was locked. The score had been mixed, the credits rolled smoothly, and the studio was already planning the press tour. The realist scene was finished. And it was good, really good, the kind of film that didn't just entertain, but lingered. But all Eliza could think about was a quiet man in work boots who hadn't said whether he'd show up when the lights went down and the screen lit up. They stood outside the garage at sunset where it had all started. The autumn air had cooled enough for jackets, and the sky glowed with streaks of orange and rose. Drew leaned against the frame of the open bay, arms crossed, watching her with a look that was softer than it used to be, but still guarded. "So that's it?" he asked. "The movie's done?" She nodded. "Picture locked. It opens next month." "Congrats," he said, and meant it. She hesitated, shifting the car keys in her hand. "There's a premiere, big one in L.A., black tie, red carpet, all of it." Drew's brow ticked up. "And you're telling me this because?" Eliza took a breath. "Because I want you there." He didn't respond immediately, just stared out across the gravel lot like it might offer an escape hatch. "I'm not a tux guy, Eliza." "I figured. You don't have to wear a tux. Hell, you don't even have to walk the carpet. But I'd like you to come. Stand next to me, not as a story. As you." Drew looked down at his boots, then at her. "That film, it's personal. You really want to tie that to someone like me?" She stepped closer, voice low. "I already did. Whether you show up or not, you're in every frame." He studied her face, looking for the script, the angle, the performance. But it wasn't there, just Eliza. Asking, not expecting. "I'll think about it," he said. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no. And in the quiet that followed, she smiled. Sometimes, "I'll think about it," is the bravest thing a man can say. Drew had never been good with words, at least not the kind you say out loud. He could talk torque specs and tire rotation patterns all day long, but emotions? Feelings? That was a different kind of engine, and he'd never quite figured out how to keep it running right. So he wrote. Late at night, after Jake had gone to bed and the shop was finally quiet, Drew sat at the kitchen table with an old notebook and a pen that skipped every third line. The light above flickered faintly, casting just enough glow to let the words spill out. No edits, no crossouts. Just him, raw and honest. Eliza, I don't know if I'll come to your premiere. Part of me wants to, just to see your face when the lights go down, to hear how the world reacts to a story you lived before you wrote it. But another part of me is still figuring out what it means to be seen that way, by everyone. Because you didn't just write a movie, Eliza. You handed the world a piece of me I didn't know I'd given. And yet, I'm not mad anymore. Not really. Because for the first time in my life, someone looked past the grease under my nails, the weight I carry, the silence I wear like armor, and told me I was worth telling a story about. So thank you for the words, for the truth, for showing up. Drew. He folded the page carefully and tucked it into a plain envelope. No name on the front, no address. He didn't plan to send it. It was just for him, a way to empty out what he couldn't say. He slid it into the junk drawer beneath the stack of old coupons and a dead flashlight and forgot about it. Jake didn't. A few days later, while looking for spare batteries, Jake found the envelope. He read it, twice, then smiled. He didn't tell Drew. He just grabbed a stamp, scribbled Eliza's name on the front, and walked it to the mailbox 2 streets over, the one Drew never checked. It was mailed before Drew even knew it was gone. Sometimes love doesn't wait for the perfect words. Sometimes it just needs a push. The lights in the theater dimmed, and a hush fell over the crowd like velvet draped across a room. Flash bulbs had stopped flashing. Cell phones were tucked away. All eyes faced the screen. Eliza sat in the front row, the heart of the event, yet somehow on the edge of it. She wore a simple black dress, not too flashy, not too understated, and held her hands tightly in her lap. Around her, executives whispered predictions, critics clutched notebooks, and a few familiar actors leaned back with a practiced, half-bored air. But Eliza wasn't thinking about reviews or reactions. She was thinking about the one person who wasn't in the room. The film began. Scene 1. The camera panned across the fictional garage, that warm amber glow of late afternoon, the mechanic wiping grease from his hands, West, her version of Drew, offering kindness without condition. It was all there, the silences, the storm, the almost confessions, the real raw beauty of 2 people trying to learn how to trust. As the story unfolded, the audience shifted. What began as curiosity turned to quiet awe. By the time the pivotal garage scene came, sniffles echoed softly through the theater. When Claire, Eliza, finally told the truth, there was a pause in the room so complete it felt sacred. And just as the credits began to roll, the door at the back of the theater opened. Eliza turned instinctively, heart lurching. There he was, Drew. No tux, no fancy shoes, just a dark jacket, clean jeans, and that quiet, steady look in his eyes like the ground would hold as long as he stayed rooted. He walked down the aisle as the names rolled past on screen, slipping into the empty seat next to her without a word. They didn't speak. She didn't ask what changed his mind. He didn't say he got the letter. They just sat there, in the afterglow of their story flickering across a silver screen. And in that quiet, something passed between them. No cameras, no lines, no performance. Just hearts, golden, and maybe finally open. The applause swelled like a rising tide, rolling through the grand theater in a standing ovation that shook the walls. Eliza stood off stage for a moment, just out of the spotlight, letting the weight of the film's final scene linger. Faces glowed in the darkness, some tear-streaked, some still stunned into silence. This was the part where she was supposed to step into the light and say a few rehearsed words. Thank the cast, praise the crew, nod to the execs, smile for the cameras. But tonight wasn't about the usual. She stepped forward slowly, heels clicking softly against the polished stage floor. The cheers dulled into a hush as she approached the mic. She stood tall but not polished, not perfect, just real. "Thank you," she began, voice steady, echoing through the hall, "for coming, for watching, for letting this story reach you." A pause. "I've made a lot of films," she continued, "but this one, the realest scene, was never meant to be a performance. It started with a man, a moment, a kindness I didn't expect when I didn't deserve it." The crowd leaned in. "He didn't know who I was. He didn't ask. He just helped, because that's who he is." She scanned the front row, her eyes finding him. "Drew Carter," she said clearly, voice shaking now. "This is your story, even if you didn't ask for it to be. You showed me what it meant to live with quiet integrity, to give without expecting, to love without needing a spotlight." Gasps rippled through the audience, heads turned. Drew blinked, still in his seat, motionless. Then slowly he stood. The room erupted. He climbed the steps to the stage with that familiar grounded walk, no nerves, no swagger, just steady. When he reached her, he didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Eliza looked up at him, heart in her throat. Their eyes met, and in front of hundreds of people, under the lights, surrounded by applause that wasn't for fame, but for truth, they smiled. Because this was the realest scene of all. And it wasn't scripted. The party raged on, just beyond the glass walls of the rooftop suite. Laughter, champagne, flashing lights, and the constant hum of conversation soaked in ego and adrenaline. But inside the small lounge, tucked off to the side, the noise faded, like the echo of a memory. Drew sat on the edge of a plush velvet couch, hands folded, tie crooked, though he hadn't meant to wear one in the first place. Across from him, Eliza slipped off her heels, her shoulders finally relaxing for the first time that night. The silence between them was warm now, not tense like before. It wrapped around them gently, like a blanket worn in just right. He looked at her, eyes calm. "That was, a lot." She smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Yeah, it was. You put my entire life on screen." He wasn't accusing her. He was just acknowledging it. "I know," she said, "but I also gave it back to you in a way people could finally see." Drew nodded, slow and thoughtful. "You're different than the woman who rolled into my garage with a busted oil pan." Eliza tilted her head. "Yeah? Better or worse?" He smirked. "Still deciding." She laughed, the sound soft and real. The same one she gave him in the garage the night of the storm, the one she didn't let the world see. "I kept thinking about that moment," she said after a pause, "when I almost told you everything and didn't. I wanted you to know the truth then, but I didn't trust myself yet." "I didn't trust much of anything," he replied, "except engines. And Jake." They both smiled at that. "I didn't expect you to show up tonight," she admitted. He looked at her, eyes steady. "I didn't expect to want to." A beat passed, then another. She leaned toward him just slightly. "So now what?" He looked out the window, where the city lights blinked like stars, trying to compete with the real thing, then back at her. "Now we see what happens when we stop writing the ending before the story's even begun," she nodded. And in that small room, away from the cameras and noise, they didn't fade out. They faded in. The early spring air in Silver Ridge smelled like motor oil, fresh-cut lumber, and change. Carter Auto had always been a one-bay garage with a crooked sign and a coffee pot that ran more sludge than brew. But now, scaffolding stretched above the gravel lot, framing out a second bay and a small office addition. The new wood gleamed like a promise. It wasn't flashy, just bigger, better. Built from the ground up, one beam at a time. Drew stood near the open bay, watching as Jake directed a crew member with the confidence of a man who'd seen every episode of Fix It or Forget It. The sight made Drew smile. His brother had a clipboard, a real one. He took it seriously. Eliza pulled up in her now permanently dusty SUV, windows down, hair tied up in a loose braid. She stepped out with a to-go cup in each hand and a toolbox balanced under one arm. Black, no sugar, she said, handing Drew his cup. He took it, grinning. You finally learning to speak mechanic? Not yet, but I figured I could start with the caffeine dialect. They stood together for a moment, watching the workers measure out where the new hydraulic lift would go. I still can't believe you're doing this, she said, without a studio behind it. He shrugged. Didn't need a studio, just needed time, and someone to remind me it was okay to build something bigger. Eliza looked at him, the quiet pride in his face, the steady way he belonged here, not to prove anything, but because this was home. I didn't want to just drop a check, she said. I wanted to be part of it. And you are, he replied, glancing at the tools in her hand, though I'm not letting you near a torque wrench yet. She laughed, and the sound blended with the clatter of tools and birdsong overhead. She'd been splitting time between Silver Ridge and L.A., editing her next project in the mornings, helping paint garage walls in the afternoon, and spending quiet evenings talking about everything and nothing over dinner with Drew and Jake. It wasn't two lives anymore. It was one that bent in the middle, city and small town, cameras and calluses. And here, beneath the rising beams of a second bay, she had found something far rarer than a perfect shot. She'd found a place to stay. The sun dipped low over Silver Ridge, casting long shadows across the gravel lot and bathing the garage in soft golden light. The new bay doors gleamed slightly under the last warmth of the day, still smelling faintly of fresh paint and sawdust. The sign above the shop now read, Carter & Company's Auto, the encoder, added in crooked metal letters that Jake had insisted on screwing in himself. Drew sat on a bench just outside the garage, sipping a cold root beer from the bottle, boots stretched out, jeans still smudged with the day's work. Eliza sat beside him, legs tucked beneath her, her hair pulled back loosely, one of Drew's old flannel shirts tied around her waist like she'd always lived here. Jake flopped down next to them, proudly holding up the new Polaroid camera Eliza had brought him from the city. He'd taken 36 photos that day, of tools, of tires, of his sandwich at lunch, and now held a print between his fingers, waving it dramatically in the air as it developed. "This one's my favorite," he declared, holding it up. Drew leaned over. It was a slightly blurry shot of the three of them, him, Eliza, and Jake, standing in front of the new garage bay, the sun flaring behind them like something out of a dream. "Not bad," Drew said with a grin. "You might put me out of work." "Then I'll hire you as my assistant," Jake replied proudly. Eliza laughed and rested her head on Drew's shoulder. "He's got vision," she said. "Runs in the family," Drew murmured. They sat like that for a while, no one talking, no one needing to, just the quiet hum of crickets starting up, the last hiss of a cooling engine somewhere in the shop, and the slow, beautiful truth of this being enough. No premiere, no headlines, no waiting for the next big moment, just three people, one bench, and a sunset that didn't care who you were, only that you showed up to see it. Life wasn't perfect. It was messy, honest, sometimes hard. But as Drew looked at Eliza, her fingers curled around his, and Jake snapped another photo beside them, he realized something. This wasn't just the end of their story. It was the beginning of their favorite one yet. Love in focus.